So I was asked to talk about something about maritime security. I'm glad that I'm not overlapping too much with the previous speaker. So I'm just going to zoom it a little bit on a more macro level and look at the competition between the United States and China and perhaps what that could mean for us here in the Philippines. I remember our previous speaker was talking about good news. Actually, in fairness, we started an AFP modernization program in 2011. We allocated $1.6 billion, and that got us actually new Air Force, of course, fighter jets, the FA-5 from South Korea, and now we're in the second tranche of that. So actually, in fairness, over the past decade, there are efforts to modernize our aerial and naval capabilities. And actually, by next year, this is almost certain, the Philippines will be an upper middle income country, so we'll be in the upper tier of ASEAN. So after Singapore and Brunei, which are small, rich countries, we'll be just behind Malaysia and Thailand, right? So we'll be ahead of Indonesia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the rest of the region. So maybe we're not so healthy, but we're not also so sick, right? So things are not as bad as perhaps we worry about, but nonetheless, there are a lot of things to look at. Now, so I'll quickly go through because we don't have much time. I know we're behind schedule. So the first thing I'll talk about the ASEAN miracle. ASEAN is a factor that we have to keep in mind. And of course, a large part of ASEAN are archipelagic nations, including Indonesia, the biggest archipelagic nation in the world. But of course, ASEAN also has a problem, which you can call it a midlife crisis. No offense to folks who are midlife here. And then third, let's talk about the Indo-Pacific. What is this Indo-Pacific? Because for a long time, we always talk about Asia-Pacific. But now we're talking about Indo-Pacific. And what are the different visions of what the Indo-Pacific could look like? And you can see how important the Philippines is to that vision. And what are the ways forward, some recommendations. Well, first of all, there's a lot of bashing of ASEAN. It's talk shop, wala nangyari. Hindi unified, there's a lot of division inside. But in fairness to the ASEAN, let's not forget that a lot of us were not alive back then, but in the 60s and 70s, a lot of ASEAN countries actually almost went to war. So you may have heard about Confrontasi, right? That was between Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore. There was a time that actually during the time of Sukarno, the Indonesians were sending military troops into the Borneo, right, and actually into Singapore. There was almost war among those countries. And let's not forget that during the time, we were also looking at invading Sabah, right? And the Malaysians were very scared of us. In fact, if you go to the WikiLeaks, there's a very interesting part in 1970s where the Malaysian government asks the British government to ask the American government to ask the Philippines not to invade Malaysia, right? That was how scared they were of us back in the 1960s. This is before the Mindanao conflict became so bad that it bogged down our military. So in the 60s, we're very advanced, and that's the reason why we were kind of the mini China in West Philippine Sea. Have you noticed we occupy 10 land features in Kalayaan, Spratlys? Do you think that that had the consent of everyone else? No. The Malaysian would have wanted them. A lot of achievement about the ASEAN. The other achievement of the ASEAN is that individually ASEAN countries mostly are irrelevant. We're just too small to matter. But ASEAN together, we have what you call convening power, right? All of these ASEAN-related summits and regional forums. So in 2007, why do you think Donald Trump, why do you think Justin Trudeau, why do you think Malcolm Turnbull, among others, visited the Philippines? They didn't visit the Philippines because of Duterte. They didn't visit the Philippines because of Philippines. They visited the Philippines because we were the chairman of the ASEAN, right? That is the importance that chairmanship of the ASEAN and being part of the ASEAN initiative does. Not to mention, of course, we also finalized an ASEAN free trade. By the way, when we export to other ASEAN countries, the tariff rates are actually between 0 to 5%. That means that it's easier for us to trade among each other. That was a great achievement, and in fact, we finalized the deal 5 years ahead of schedule. That's why we were so optimistic that we can have an economic community. Yun nga lang, naging sobrang optimistic naman tayo. And now we're, of course, still struggling to go forward. But of course, as Arthur Miller, the playwright, said, an era can be considered over when its basic illusions have been exhausted. The problem, though, is, ASEAN is great in terms of creating unity among us smaller countries and creating prosperity, but it's not effective in terms of allowing us ASEAN countries to stand up to other big countries, particularly China. And of course, as Lee Kuan Yew, the great leader of Singapore, or some, it's a long topic, I'll just keep it there. As the great leader of Singapore said, rise of China Rise of China in the sense that, I mean, let's just put it into numbers. China's GDP has expanded by almost 10 times in the last 25 years. No other country in human history has expanded so fast. Neither the South Koreans nor the Japanese. And the Chinese did it with 1 billion people. So one of the ironic things in history is that a communist country is the most successful capitalist experience in human history, right? So keep that in mind. So China's is so huge, according to Lee Kuan Yew, that when it changes, it doesn't only need adjustment from the rest of the world, it will change the very global order, right? And the way by which we even interact with each other. And that challenge is, of course, most pronounced for us here in ASEAN, because Southeast Asia is the historical backyard of China. We feel it more than any other region in the world. And the thing is, what helped ASEAN to come together is now dividing us. So the two principles of muafarat and mushawara, consensus-based decision-making and consultation-based decision-making process, was great when it's tayo-tayo lang nag-uusap, di ba? Kasi if it's consultation-based, that means Indonesia doesn't bully Brunei, right? Philippines doesn't bully Malaysia. We work together. Well, that's fantastic when like-minded countries come together. But when it's us dealing with China, we are highly divided. Because some ASEAN countries are much more dependent on China. A country like Cambodia, for instance, half of their national budget is aid from China. That's not the case in the Philippines, right? There are countries whereby 1/3 of their foreign direct investments in the case of Singapore is in China. That's not the case in the Philippines. So we have different threat perceptions, different levels of dependencies on China. That is why all China has to do for ASEAN to be ineffective is to just convince one country to say no and nothing happens. That is the problem with consensus-based decision-making, because in the ASEAN, we do not understand consensus and consensus. We understand consensus as unanimity. And this is the problem that we're facing today. And that is why, if you look at the ASEAN, we have not achieved much when it comes to negotiating a code of conduct with China, pressuring the Chinese to actually become much more respecting of the rights of smaller countries in the region. Kasi ang daming kaaway ng China, hindi lang Pilipinas eh. Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, right? And then my Taiwan aspect pa, which complicates the factor. At the same time, the Chinese are also putting forward all these kinds of economic initiatives to woo the countries in the region. So the Chinese are not just coercive, they're also incentivizing us, they're charming us. So it's what you can call charm offensive, although sometimes more offensive than charming, right? It's a combination of the two. And in fact, in 2013, an important keynote speech, Xi Jinping talked about the necessity for peripheral diplomacy. So itong panahon na yan, ano nangyari noong 2013 dito sa Pilipinas? What did we do with respect to China? Do you remember what we did in 2013? So 2012 was what? Scarborough Shoal, right? 2013 in January, what did we do? We initiated the arbitration award against China, right? That was when the Chinese were realizing that smaller countries are fighting back, and they were quite worried about that. So the Chinese strategy was this: if they want to stand up to us, we'll buy them out, right? We'll provide them all sorts of different economic incentives, and that's exactly what they do. So in October 2013, Premier Li Keqiang visits the ASEAN and promises the 2+7 framework. You know, the Chinese like this kind of kung fu sounding stuff in 2+7. So the 2 is apparently 2 new political and security agreements, initiatives, and the 7 is all about economic perks. And then later on, those economic perks were much more solidified and concretized in terms of the so-called Maritime Silk Road Initiative. And then, of course, they built the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And then, of course, in 2015, Xi Jinping pushed for the free trade area for the Asia Pacific, which will be the biggest free trade area, if ever, of course, it comes into fruition. The thing, though, is while the Chinese were offering us all of those kinds of economic initiatives, they were also moving out and trying to consolidate what we call the first island chain, right? So the first island chain, and this is very interesting, the Chinese idea of naval domination comes from Alfred Thayer Mahan, who's an American, right? And the Chinese are saying this. You know, the Chinese always say we are unique, we are the oldest civilization, blah, blah, blah. But they actually are copying a lot of things from the Western countries. As you know, where did the United States start? The United States started in a place in the world that is 12 hours, that has a 12 hours difference with us, right? In East Coast of America, right? That's where they started. How do you think the Americans reached Hawaii and the Philippines? Through expansion, right? In fact, if you go to Mein Kampf of Hitler, don't read it, but if ever you do, There's a part where Hitler says he learned his idea of territorial expansion from the Americans. How did the America become America? They killed a lot of Red Indians, right? Million of them. Why do you think New Mexico is called New Mexico? Because it was part of Mexico. They didn't even have a shame to take out the Mexico. It's like, imagine like the Chinese will take Luzon and they call it New Luzon or something like that, right? So the Americans were first continental expansionists, and then once they consolidated from East Coast, meaning New York, all the way to West Coast, in Los Angeles, let's say, then they thought about dominating adjacent waters, the Caribbean. So Caribbean to China is, Caribbean to US is what South China Sea and East China Sea is to China. In fact, the Chinese will say, well, the Caribbean is named Caribbean, but South China Sea and East China Sea are named China Seas, right? That's why tayo pinalitan natin yung pangalan, ginawa natin West Philippine Sea. Although nagalit yung Malaysians at yung mga Vietnamese kasi may sarili din pangalan mga yan. But the problem though is, the Americans were not happy with just dominating Caribbean. The next thing they said is they declared the Monroe Doctrine. What is the Monroe Doctrine? They declared that the entire Western Hemisphere, entire Americas is their business. So they gradually kick out the British and the French, and they almost went to war over Venezuela. Right? The Persian Empire controlled the Persian Gulf and parts of Mediterranean. If you watch 300, those kind of stupid movies. The Romans controlled the Mediterranean, right? So this is what great powers do. In fact, there's nothing unique with China. It's just copying what other Western and non-Western major powers did. The problem, though, is that China is not only looking at dominating first island chain, it's also looking at dominating second island chain. Nonetheless, the Chinese are behind schedule. Based on one naval study that came out in the 1980s, the Chinese were expected to dominate the first island chain by around 3 years ago. So they're a little bit behind schedule. And then by 2025 to 2030, they have to dominate the so-called second island chain. Ito yung tinatawag na Western Pacific at kasama po doon ang Benham Rise. Kaya ngayon, nagda-double time po yung mga Chino, so sabay sila nag-move. That's why, if you have followed the news, last February, Secretary Lorenzana said that there were Chinese submarines operating within the Benham Rise, which was extremely suspicious, right? By the way, the Benham Rise is part of our extended continental shelf. We have exclusive economic rights there, and countries cannot just roam there without their permission unless they conduct what international law calls right of innocent passage, movement from point A to B. Hindi pwedeng umikot ganyan-ganyan, which is exactly what they did. Suspicious po yan. And of course, if you follow really what's happening on the ground, one possibility is that the Chinese are trying to track the movements of American warships and submarines in the area. So it's a sonar surveillance operation. And in fact, they were placing sonar surveillance gadgets near Hawaii. So now they're doing that in the Benham Rise close to the Philippines. And then of course, nalaman pa natin, few years ago pala, I think 2014, para lumabas lang ngayon, ang mga Chino ay nag-rename ng 5 undersea land features dyan sa Benham Rise into Chinese names. Unilaterally, with no respect for us whatsoever. And potentially, they have also conducted a unilateral maritime seismic undertaking. Maritime scientific research in the area. So the Chinese are double timing now, are trying to move into both areas, second island chain and first island chain. The first island chain will protect China and allow China to actually box in Taiwan, right? Because if they dominate the first island chain, then the US and other countries cannot help Taiwan from that. They can only help Taiwan from the second island chain. Once they dominate both island chains, Taiwan will automatically be part of China. And the unification vision will finally be completed. And of course, any Chinese leader who does that will go down in history as one of their greatest leaders. And Xi Jinping probably wants to be that guy. She wants to be that guy. Now, of course, this is the thing. Some of our friends, including here in the Philippines, say, lahat naman nagre-reclamation, wala naman pagkakaiba eh. Well, there's a big difference. The Chinese reclamation is a whole different level. Every country is doing reclamation, with the exception of the Philippines. Tayo yung nasa traffic na sumusunod lang sa traffic, tapos binabangga tayo, kasi no one else follows the traffic, right? This is the problem. On the ground, it's a scramble. And this was my criticism of the Aquino administration. The Aquino administration was strong in terms of legal warfare and diplomatic criticism, Pero on the ground, wala po tayong ginawang upgrading or improving or maintaining yung facilities natin. Thanks to Secretary Lorenzana, finally this year in-upgrade at mini-maintain po natin yung facilidad natin sa Pag-asa. Kasi mukha na tayong squatter doon. No? Kumpara doon sa facilities ng, forget about China, facilities ng Vietnam. Pag nakita niyo yung layang-layang ng Malaysia, it's like, El Nido, right? Or Boracay, or Taiwan, right? Which they have a huge port doon sa Ito Aba, which is the largest naturally formed land feature. And then, and China's reclamation is again a whole different level. So they have done already 3 of these, the giant one. So ito yung Tito Alan, ito yung Pag-asa sa atin, no? Tayong nauna dyan 1979, meron na tayo Pero limited lang yung mga aircrafts na pwede niya accommodate, assuming okay pa yung paved pa yung asphalt doon, which is not the case anymore, right? Kaya nga inayos po ngayon ni Secretary Lorenzana. Pero yung sa Chinese, it's so big it can accommodate anything. Probably even SM malls if they want to put their own Trump Towers. And this is the Game of Thrones that we have there in the South China Sea. Actually, the country that occupies the most land features is, in the strategies, Vietnam. Tiny Vietnam, right? Or as they call the Prussian state of Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese control the most land feature, but the sexiest ones are controlled by China, right? Because they made it so big artificially and so developed, right? So now the Chinese are in a position. Now if you look at this, tayong problemado kasi the Vietnamese ones are here. Wala tayong paki masyado dyan. Ito yung mga mahalaga sa atin, no? Itong Subi Reef, no? Itong Gavin Reef, Mischief Reef, dito tayo Tignan mo to. So ito yung Pag-asa, no? So pag nagsisurveillance tayo dito, hinaharas tayo ng mga Chinese na nandito. No, nung last time na pumunta si General Anyo, Secretary Anyo ngayon, at saka si Secretary Lorenzana, nung pumasok sila dito, kasi syempre ikot-ikot ka bago ka mag-land, di ba? Hinaharas sila dito. So every time we do surveillance operations there, the Chinese here keep on harassing us. And then of course, they're trying to move closer to us to get a low tide elevation, which is very close to the Pag-asa, so that they can bump out their territorial sea here. Kaya nga, totoo na Vietnam yung pinaka nag-occupy, but China is our biggest problem because it's their big islands that are close to our areas that we have under control. So the geography is also very important. Now, on Code of Conduct, walang nangyari, mukhang niloko lang tayo. Arbitration Award, this is important. Maraming nagsabi, walang silbing arbitration award na yan, hindi naman susunod ng China. Well, it actually is making some impact. If you look at the Chinese, they're not using the term 9-dash line so much anymore. Because 9-dash line now is legally a joke. Now, why would China care? China cares the same way that US pretends to be law-abiding. We know that the United States, great powers are exceptional. What does it mean? They're exceptional because they take exception to the rules, right? But nonetheless, they have to put a pretense. Why? Because power is not about muscle, it's about authority. And authority is about legitimacy. And legitimacy comes with, certain level of respect for common rules. The thing with China is that they cannot claim to be the leader of Asia, because that's what they want to be, if they're seen as just any other bully, right? This is the problem with the Russians. The Russians are the most powerful in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but everyone hates them, because they just roll in the tanks if they don't like you, right? That's exactly what they do. That's why if you're Central Asian, Eastern European, you join NATO, right? Or you become friend more with China or US or so on and so forth. Now, the Chinese cannot do that, and the Chinese do not think that way. And the Chinese care about reputation. There's something called reputational cost, because reputation brings authority, right? And since our arbitration award came out, the Chinese abandoned more or less the 9-dash line doctrine, and now they use the Forsha doctrine. So the Forsha doctrine, it's a bit legalist, but the idea is this. So doon sa arbitration award natin, pinakita natin na wala pong isla per Article 121, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS. Kasi kung may isla, per international law, that means it can generate another 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone. So mag-overlap yung mga isla sa Kalayaan sa ating EEZ, right? But the arbitration award said walang isla. You only have rocks and low tide elevations. And rocks can only generate 12 nautical miles territorial sea. So mga Chino, they came up with an alternative explanation. Sabi na, sige, tama ka na yung mga land features na yan ay hindi isla. Pero together, when you put them together, they're an archipelagic feature that can generate another 200 nautical miles. And they raised that last year in 2017 in Washington DC, among others. Guess what? Pinagtawanan lang sila. So then again, this year, the Chinese had discovered a new map. Parang dun sa bago nilang map, yung South China Sea ay part of China. But then again, everyone laughed at them. So the fact of the matter is that the Chinese put up a strong front. They say they don't care. But behind the scenes, actually, they know that their reputation is in danger, right? It doesn't mean that reputation is all they care about. But there is a part of them that still cares about reputation. That's why they're coming up. That is why we had the leverage. Imagine if hindi tayo nag-file ng arbitration at all. What's the reason for the Chinese to even care about what we have to say, right? We have no leverage whatsoever. That is why we could have extracted concessions from the Chinese, because they care about their reputation. Because what the Chinese want us to do is to say, mali po yung arbitration award natin, kalimutan natin yan, right? And that way they could save their face. And face is very important, of course, for the Chinese. And of course, the other concern is we have split. Nonetheless, our good president comes in, he shocks everything on all levels, right? But in the case of the ASEAN, the shocking thing with President, I mean, this is it. Ang problema sa atin sa Pilipinas is not that, it's not that we are dramatic, it's just that it's like we're a telenovela that goes from bida to kontrabida, right? So under Aquino, we were the most anti-China country in ASEAN, right? By far. Even the Vietnamese couldn't compete with us. Under Duterte, suddenly Cambodians are scared that they will never get the gold medal of loyalty to China because the President Duterte's rhetoric, at least, is very pro-China. I have never heard a president anywhere in the world except the Chinese president who says, I love the Chinese leadership, right? That they love me. Or there was a time that the president said, to get the Chinese mercy, you need to be humble and meek. And of course, again, we can always say it's misunderstanding, context po yan, all of those kinds of excuses. But that's not how the international community views that, right? But the thing is this, when President Duterte was the chairman of the ASEAN, he had a lot of power because the chairman of the ASEAN can issue a statement unilaterally and the chairman of the ASEAN can dictate what will be the agenda of ASEAN in that year, right? If you study basic political science, that's called the second phase of power, agenda setting. Kaya napakalakas ng media, di ba? Kasi they can set the agenda. But what did we do last year? As the ASEAN chair, we said essentially, kalimutan natin yung West Philippines and South China Sea dispute. Focus po tayo sa counterterrorism and North Korea. I agree that we should have focused on North Korea. I agree that we should focus on counterterrorism. But I think what we did there was we strengthened China's hand. In fact, in November, I remember President Duterte said the disputes in the South China Sea should be left untouched by the international community. Na kami-kami lang mag-usap with China. What do you think is the problem? What do you think is the problem if the disputes is only left between Philippines and China or Vietnam and China? The problem is that the moment we said na bahala na kayo dyan, umalis na kayo dito, kami nang bahala ng China, we weakened our negotiating positions. No one is asking for war here. And by the way, China is the last country that wants war. Why do you think China doesn't want war in the West Philippines or South China Sea? First of all, where do you think China's trade passes? 80% of Chinese trade passes through South China Sea and adjacent waters. Where do you think China's oil comes through? It comes through South China Sea. If there's a war between Philippines and China, obviously matalong Pilipinas. But what do you think will be the reaction of Malaysia and Singapore? Do you think they'll be friendlier with China or they'll be friendlier with US and enemies of China? Obviously, they will hedge their bets and move to the other side, right? The moment that there's a war between Philippines and China, China will be isolated. Not to mention that will be used as an excuse by other countries like Japan and like US to further fortify their military position in this area. My God. Anyways, let's go. I'll get a little bit frustrated. 101 na kasi kailangan sa Malacanang on this issue. But anyway, so what happened under ASEAN last year is that ASEAN was already weak. But what happened with President Duterte was that he allowed ASEAN to be used by China as a shield. Whereby the Chinese said, kami nang bahala ng ASEAN mag-usap ukol sa West Philippine Sea, umalis na kayo dyan mga Amerikano, Hapon, huwag kayong makialam dito. In fact, ito yung nakakatuwa, naalala ko last year in ASEAN Regional Forum, Secretary Cayetano was there, and he was asked about the arbitration award. At essentially, sinabi ni Secretary Cayetano, of course, I'm paraphrasing here, kasi ang nangyari is, nag-meeting yung America, Japan, at Australia, And guess what they said? Sabi ng tatlong bansa na yan, the Philippines Arbitration Award is final and binding and we call on all parties to abide by it. Secretary Cayetano comes out and essentially says something like, it is our sovereign right not to assert our sovereign right under our arbitration award, right? So in short, parang, hindi na sinabi yan, but his point was, it is our prerogative whether we want to raise that arbitration award with China or not. But that's essentially what you're saying. Kasi yung arbitration award na yan ay nagdi-defend sa ating sovereign rights. Not only in our territorial sea, but in our entire exclusive economic zone, right? In the South China Sea. And we are talking about potentially trillions of dollars of energy resources, fishery resources, and God knows all of those kinds of unknown minerals there below, right? In exchange for what? Few billions of promise by China. And where is the money right here? I'm still curious about it. Anyway, the problem is, when Singapore became the ASEAN chairman, kumbaga the card has been already set, you know? So, nahirapan din ng Singapore. So even now, Singapore is actually striking a much more cordial tone towards China. And what do you think is China's reaction? So China feels emboldened, right? So earlier this year, in the middle of this year, that's President Xi Jinping. Of course, there's a cartoon character, Winnie the Pooh. President Xi Jinping, he oversaw the biggest Chinese ever naval exercise in the South China Sea. It was huge, right? And this year, guess what? So ito na nga, mabait na tayo sa China, hindi natin ni-raise yung arbitration award, we said na mahal natin sila, so on and so forth. Beshi, and this is what the Chinese are doing. This year, the militarization of the South China Sea got even worse. So for the very first time, the Chinese have deployed surface-to-air missiles, anti-cruise ballistic missiles, electronic jamming equipment, nuclear-capable bombers, at yung reclamation activities actually accelerated in the past year. So what I'm saying here is that it seems there's no evidence to suggest that our conciliatory approach towards China is bearing us result. Because the result is very clear. The Chinese are even further strengthening their position on the ground at the expense of other countries in the region. At the same time, of course, the promise was kung mabait tayo sa China, ang China mag-invest sa Pilipinas. Where's the money? Alam ko maraming online casino dito at nagiging mahal yung apartment sa daming Chinese na pumapasok. But I'm talking about infrastructure investments, big investments that create jobs for Filipino people that really make our country a much more developed country. Where is the evidence for that? So far, we don't see that. And the fact of the matter is that if we go across the ASEAN region, even yung mga bansa na very friendly sa China, pati sila ngayon medyo na-frustrate na rin sila sa Chinese investments. Because what the Chinese do is, they go around the region, offer them big investments. In exchange, they expect what? They expect deference, right? This is essentially the Chinese this is a new tributary system, right? Because remember, nung panahon ng Middle Ages time, right? The Sultanate of Sulu will go to China, kowtow the Chinese emperor, and in exchange will have trade with them, right? On whichever terms they wanted. And essentially what they're trying to do is to repeat that. But around the region, if you go, Malaysia, for instance, has canceled $40 billion of Chinese investments. There is a concerns over corruption, irregularity, so on and so forth. The Indonesians are complaining about the fact that the big train project between Bandung and Jakarta is still not being completed after this is 4 years already, and there's not much happening. The Thai-Chinese rail project also has huge concerns. And then of course in Vietnam there was mass protests when there was discussions about Chinese investments. And this is where the Indo-Pacific comes in. My worry is that because the ASEAN and individual ASEAN countries are not standing up to China, the other guys outside there are saying, we step in and we take charge of this situation because hindi nila kaya i-manage yung China. Kami yung bahala dyan. And of course, the United States today increasingly is talking about Indo-Pacific. As Admiral Harris puts it, from Hollywood to Bollywood, right? That's now the area of operations for the Americans, and the two are interconnected. And tignan nyo, napakamahalagang Pilipinas, we're perfectly at the center, right? My goodness, tayo ang Middle Kingdom, right? Hindi sila. And of course, Davao is the imperial capital. This is what you have to keep in mind, how important we are. And of course, South China Sea is where the Pacific and the Indian Ocean are getting connected, right? And we know how important these areas. Just look at just the numbers, right?
90% of global commerce is through oceans, and a lot of that, 7% of that is actually going through the Indian Ocean, right? And 85% of Chinese-bound oil passes through the Indian Ocean. This is important in so many different ways, right? Now, there are 3 different visions of the Indo-Pacific, and each vision has its own implication. So this year, in the Shangri-La Dialogue, the Indian Prime Minister put forward his own version of the Indo-Pacific. His version essentially is, we will engage with China where we can, and where there's economic benefit, but we'll push back against China where it's necessary. And the Indian version is, hindi kami aasa sa Amerika lang, kahit kami-kami lang, Japan, India, ASEAN, South Korea, Australia, we can take care of China. That's essentially the Indian version of dealing with this issue. The Americans, though, have essentially declared a new Cold War on China. So over the past month alone, these are everything that has been happening. The Americans have imposed new tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese products, plus the $50 billion area this year. That makes it $250 billion, and have promised to double that down. The Americans are putting new restrictions on Chinese investments. The US has already disinvited China from major exercises like RIMPAC, and this month they also canceled defense dialogue and strategic dialogue between Secretary Mattis and their Chinese counterpart. And then, unlike the Obama administration, the Trump administration is more openly confrontational towards China. They have stepped up their so-called freedom of navigation operations. Anong kahalagaan ng freedom of navigation operations? Bakit dapat may paki tayo dyan? Remember, what does the freedom of navigation achieve? The idea behind the freedom of navigation is this. The Chinese claim that the land features, the fake islands they build, are actual islands that have territorial sea and exclusive economic zone. What the Americans do is that they go in your face and they just roam through the area to tell the Chinese, wala siyang territorial sea, that's a fake island, right? That is why Justice Carpio quite correctly says that the freedom of navigation operations of US are an indirect way of implementing the Philippines Arbitration Award. Because the Philippines Arbitration Award questioned whether those land features are actual islands and whether they belong to China. So when the Americans conduct freedom of navigation operations, they're essentially saying that ruling is valid and we don't follow the Chinese interpretation of international law. That is wrong. And guess what? Over the past year, it's not only the United States doing more freedom of navigation operations, including, by the way, po sa Scarborough Shoal, kasi wala tayong kakayan, kaya ang mga Amerikano nag-challenge dyan. The Japanese also send aircraft carriers in the area. The British have done freedom of navigation operations. The Australians are doing aerial navigation operations. Even the French have come into the picture, are doing freedom of navigation operations. So big powers are coming in and challenging China's efforts to essentially create what some critics will call a Chinese lake. I don't go that far, but the fact of the matter is that our arbitration award is indirectly providing a legal pretext and basis for this freedom of navigation operations. That is why we cannot say that wala tayong manok dyan, right? Because since we cannot do it ourselves, we are relying on the international community to do that in our behalf. Now, there's a third version. There's the Indonesian version of the Indo-Pacific, which I think Singapore and a lot of us in ASEAN will agree with. The idea of Indonesia is this. So, if the Indians are saying congagement, so it's containment and engagement. If the Americans are talking about mostly containment, the Indonesian version is proactive socialization of China. Their idea is this: you cannot exclude China from the Indo-Pacific. China is a major neighbor. They are inevitability. Pwede mo piliin yung kaibigan mo, pero hindi yung kapitbahay mo. At least in the case of nations, right? That's our problem. We don't know if US will be here in 20 years, 50 years, but we know the Chinese will most likely be here for another 1,000 years as they have been. Baka tayong wala by that time, right? So the Indonesian position is, we have to constantly try to influence China to be a much more effective partner, right? But at the same time, behind the scenes, the Indonesians are also strengthening their naval capabilities, strengthening their cooperation with India and other countries. And if you look at Indonesia, may ginawa rin silang kakaiba recently. Okay, let me just go back. Ito. So this is South China Sea, di ba? The problem is, yung dulo ng 9-dash line ng China, hindi klaro. So nag-overlap siya dito sa waters ng Indonesia, right? Natuna Sea, off the Natuna Islands. So ang ginawa ng Indonesia is to say, they renamed the area, they called it North Natuna Sea, and they deployed more naval vessels there. And then, yung fisheries secretary, minister ng Indonesia, look at her in New York Times. There's a great feature about her. She's this crazy woman with tattoos and everything like that. She's a gangster. What she does is that pag hinuli niya yung mga illegal fishermen's vessels, binobomba niya. He just burns them and bombs them, right? She keeps on doing that. And in fact, the evidence suggests that over the past year, illegal fishing in Indonesian waters has dropped dramatically since the introduction of the dramatic policy by the Indonesia. Baka siguro meron tayong matutunan. Now, that's why I'm saying, strategy is a matter of mind games. If you're weak in the mind and if you internalize weakness, you're always going to be loser in international affairs. Even if you're a small country like Vietnam or a poor country like Indonesia, if you stand your ground, you can actually have a leverage. That is why it's very important for the Philippines that we do not just accept that just because we're small and weak or poorer country, that the Chinese can just get their way with us. We have to learn from our neighbors. Let's learn from Vietnam, let's learn from Indonesia, and let's learn from Malaysia right now under Mahathir, whereby Mahathir, when he was in Beijing last month, inside Beijing's Great Hall of People, he said he warned about quote-unquote new colonialism. So of course he was talking about China, right? So let's get inspiration from our fellow neighboring countries. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. Now, just moving forward, so for me, the Indo-Pacific depends on how you define it, but I hope it doesn't mean that ASEAN is now irrelevant and then mga big boys na lang bahala dyan. We don't want that too. So our position in the Philippines should be to encourage dialogue among countries, but at the same time, we should welcome efforts by America and other countries to push back against excessive claims by China, because we cannot do that ourselves, right? And the other thing is, actually, Japan and United States and Australia, they're also doing capacity building. Meron na tayong mga bagong multi-role vessels sa ating Philippine Coast Guard. Saan po galing yan? Sa Japan po galing yan. Yung mga corvettes natin na refurbish natin, galing sa US Coast Guard yan. In fact, ang US nag-offer po sila ngayon ng F-16 fighters to us, right? And other modern gadgets. They're also giving us $60 million in new foreign military financing. None of that is enough. That's why lahat sila dapat tumulong sa atin. Capacity building is the way forward, because ito nga yung problema natin eh. We are one of the biggest archipelagic nations in the world. Our coastline is almost as long as that of the Federation of Russia. That's how big it is. I think number 5 in the world or number 6 in the world. But we have such an almost puny coast guard, which is common sea line of communication, perhaps the most important in the world, where $5 trillion of money, $5 trillion of trade passes through every year. I think we have to also support the proposal by Prime Minister Mahathir for demilitarization, meaning the Chinese will stop militarizing those artificial islands, no exercises, naval exercises in that area, and then the Americans also should stop their freedom of navigation operation once the Chinese do that. And then Jokowi, the president of Indonesia, has talked about a proposal for joint patrols. Bakit hindi yung mga bansa na walang claim sa South China Sea mag-joint patrol sila to make sure na hindi mag-aaway or hindi magkakaroon ng escalation dyan? So there are all sorts of different proposals that are being put forward. And lastly, we have to reiterate what we put forward back in 2003. We need to have a triple freeze. Hindi lang code of conduct. A freeze on militarization, a freeze on reclamation, and a freeze on aggressive naval activities. This is the way that we should do it as the Philippines, and as you saw it, I'm quoting you and I'm showing you what all other small countries in the region are doing. Perhaps it's time for us to learn from them, because they learned a lot from us when we filed an arbitration award against China. Thank you very much.